The fear arrives, unannounced, unseen. I know it's here. I feel the weight of the shadow it casts over me. Its servants, specters and apparitions that haunt my mind, anxiety, loneliness, depression, rage. In a chorus of voices, they seek to drown me out, keep me silent with anguish and paralyzed in the darkness. But somewhere, a small, still voice whispers, "Don't give up just yet. Keep walking. Lift your head up, and hope will show you the way."
It is January. January is really in gear now, right? How are those resolutions going? Yeah, we say. I decided this year I'm going to lose 10 pounds. So 15 pounds to go. You know how it is, right? The January actually, January literally comes from the Latin meaning door. So the idea is that it's a door to new beginnings. Right? So when every year we begin January, it's the door month. It's the month of new beginnings. But I kind of been thinking about it a little bit and thinking, well, maybe what I actually need is a door to close out last year. It's not so much a new door for this year, but it's how do I keep all of that stuff back there? And perhaps you notice that in these kind of few first days of this month, a lot of stuff from last year starts kind of crashing in. Credit card bills start to arrive this week from Christmas time, and that's pretty terrifying for some of us. And you realize that, okay, that wasn't quite as good an idea as I thought it was. Now, there's really dark statistics that hit us about January. January is the highest month for registering claims for divorce in the Western world. There's something about this month, and perhaps it's because of last year, and perhaps it's because of this year, but it starts to break us a little bit. More personal bankruptcies are registered in January than any other month of the year. But then there are these other things that haunt us, the things that we come to talk about in a series like this, things that maybe pushed through from last year, perhaps even the year before. The things that haunt us are stress, our overwhelm, our exhaustion, our obsessions, our fears, our anxieties, our compulsions, our burnout, and our depression. These ghosts that simmer around in our lives, perhaps not seen to everybody else that we're around, or perhaps only seen to some of us, but they're very, very real. And so we've made it our tradition here at Westside to begin our years, now we've been doing it for a few years, where we begin our year in a place of sensitivity. We begin our year with some questions about what's going on inside of our minds, what's going on in us that we confess is real even though it's unseen. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And how I like to try and do this is to wrestle alongside some metaphors and some stories that will help us and guide us in that. Stories that will connect us to perhaps a bigger idea of where it is we sit on this particular journey. So for this series and for the next 3 weeks, we're going to journey with one of the oldest stories in the world. A story that predates any other book in the Bible, and some scholars think perhaps predates many of the stories that have ever existed. A deep, haunting story of a man named Job. Job, the storyteller, informs us in the book that he has in the Bible, while Job is neither Christian nor even Jewish, the storyteller tells us he is a good man. In fact, the storyteller tells us he is the greatest man in the East. The text says that Job was blameless and upright. Tam Vashar is the Hebrew. Tam Vashar quite literally means he was whole and right. Think about that. He was whole. This man, Job, he had land, he had servants, he had animals, he had kids, he was wealthy, he was popular, he was healthy. Job, the greatest man in the East, was whole. I sometimes hear that thought, and the Hebrew expresses it so well, this idea of wholeness, which is what so many of us pursue. What would it be like to be whole? What would that be like? Now, of course, many of us know, whether we've read the story or not, that the reason we've told the story of Job for thousands and thousands of years is not because he's whole and all together. Because, of course, this story, Job's wholeness falls apart. In fact, it falls apart very, very quickly. The writer tells you that he has it all together, and within a few sentences, it all starts falling apart on Job. His wealth is stolen. His property is destroyed. A tragic accident kills all of his children in one single moment. Worse than that, then, his health starts to fall apart, and he's covered with sores. So Job goes from being whole and having it all together to watching every single piece of his life fall apart. His wealth, his popularity, his family, and his health. So by the second chapter of this breakneck poem, Job is sat on a pile of ashes with a piece of broken jar scratching at his already painful skin. In chapter 1, he is the greatest man in the East. He has the life that everybody envies. He has it all together. People look at Job and say, if only we could be like Job. And chapter 2, he sat on a pile of ashes, harming himself in the midst of his pain. Job is not whole. Job is not right. The great psychologist Carl Jung invested himself profoundly in this story because he found this story fascinating as an insight into humans. But Jung was driven by something which may not surprise you if you know bits of his work. He said this, I must learn to know why and to what purpose Job was wounded. He's driven by the sense of what's going on in this story. How does Job end up here? Why does Job end up here? This big, huge why question. And of course, as you read the story, that's the question that drives Job's friends. I always feel, I'm just going to have to assume this for the rest of the series, whenever we talk about Job's friends, we put like kind of little marks up like this. Because as you read it, you think with friends like these, who needs enemies, right? And Job's friends turn up, and that's the question they want to talk about. Imagine this, they come and they sit silently for a while with this man who's suffered incredible tragedy, and they sit with him, and then they start to ask the question, why? Because of course, as we all deeply know, and we all relate to this profoundly, that when you're in the midst of profound suffering, what you really need is analysis. Like that really helps. When people start to figure out, where did you go wrong? And as his friends start to have this long and lengthy conversation with him about probably what's going on here, and various forms of theory are presented, and all these things are put forward, because surely if we talk enough, if we throw enough theories around, we'll figure out what's up with you, Job. And that'll really help. The tragic thing about the story of Job, but perhaps the thing as we wrestle with it over the next few weeks that will bring hope to us, but let's just put this out there. Over the 42 chapters of Job, he never finds out the answer why. Job never finds out what goes on and why it happens. You, the reader, as you read the story, will realize there's other things going on, but Job never finds that out. So if we're going to invest ourselves in this terrible story of tragedy, we have to decide right at the start, Jung's question isn't our question. Why did this happen? The story must be deeper than that. The story must be just deeper than a simple story of how to avoid this happening to yourself. There must be more in it as to why has Scripture preserved this story? Why has history preserved this story? And so I wonder if perhaps the story is found and made sense of when we dive into and listen to Job himself. So I want to jump into a piece of Job for you this morning. It's the first speech that we hear from him. And here's the thing. I often find when I read Scripture, and this has been a tradition of English translations of Scriptures over the years, we kind of want to put Scripture into church language, right? So what happens is, because church language is good and proper and right, and everybody understands it, and it feels kind of like the Queen is reading the Bible to you. And the problem I find with a lot of the translations of Job is that this guy suffered immense tragedy, but still sounds like the Queen. And I kind of feel if I went through what Job went through, I would be a little more raw than that. So I've wrestled around for the last little while in preparation for this series to find a translation of the Hebrew that kind of wrestles some of the rawness. The classical translator Stephen Mitchell put together a translation of Job in the late 1970s called Into the Whirlwind, and I think he does it well. The text is kind of ugly sometimes. It's a little bit raw, but throughout this series, we'll be using his text. So if you're looking through your translation thinking that feels a little different, that's why. Because what Mitchell's tried to do is reference this as poetry, but with the deep rawness of the Hebrew, the ugliness of the Hebrew. I think you'll see what I mean as we read it. In chapter 3, Job speaks for the first time. He says this, "God should damn the day I was born, and the night that forced me from the womb. On that day let there be darkness. Let it never have been created. Let it sink back into the void. Let chaos overpower it. Let black clouds overwhelm it. Let the sun be plucked from its sky. Let oblivion overshadow it. Let the other days disown it. Let the aeons swallow it up. Why couldn't I have died as they pulled me out of the dark? Why were there knees to hold me and breasts to keep me alive? Why is there light for the wretched, life for the bitter-hearted, who long for death, who seek it as if it were buried treasure, who smile when they reach the graveyard and laugh as their pit is dug?" Job sat on ashes, harming himself, speaks this raw language of absolute despair. Job finds himself in a place where he just can't figure out why he's still alive. And not only does Job think that it's bad that he's still alive, he'd prefer it if they went back in history and just blotted out the day he was born. Let's just get rid of that day so that I am forever forgotten. Job, perhaps you might say, is living at the brink of dying. See, anyone who's ever suffered, which is all of us in different ways, anyone who's ever suffered can probably feel moments of resonance with Job. When he speaks these words, perhaps your pain is similar to Job's, perhaps your pain is different from Job's, but you probably resonate to that sense of, why am I even here, and what is the point of me? Because external, physical, tangible pain is one thing. But often we realize that what goes on in our hearts or what goes on in our minds can be completely different. It seems to thrive on thin air. And as you read your way through the story of Job, what you realize is all of the tragedy happens in the first few verses. And that physical pain is contained to a very small moment of the story. But the mental pain, the internal anguish, the emotional trauma starts to grow. Because what goes on inside of us seems to thrive on this thin air. It grows and develops beyond its circumstances. Because as we try to make sense of what's going on in our lives, so often this pain and torment starts to grow. And so for Job, what seems cruel is that he's still alive. He's broken. He's not whole, but he's not dead. And I think that's at the root of what you can only call depression for Job. As you read Job, you find a man who has found himself sunk. His situation is outside of his control, but as he reflects on it, he finds himself in darker and darker spaces. And so what I want to do with Job throughout this series is use him as a metaphor of sorts, as a journey partner for those of us who struggle with our own mental health. Because in Job, what you see is an unseen battle, the effects of which are profoundly real for him. And that's the journey that so many people walk today. This unseen battle. There's something going on behind the scenes that even Job himself doesn't understand. Job himself doesn't even really know about it. But something happened and something triggered something and something got set off, and now Job finds himself here. And many of us, brothers and sisters, moms and dads, children, sitting in a room like this, relate to that sense of there's something unseen that I don't entirely understand, but here is where I am, and this journey is profoundly real for us. Anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, self-harm, despair. Andrew Solomon, whose writing on this subject has become almost a textbook for me as we work through this series over the years, says this: depression is the flaw in love. To creatures who love, to be creatures who love, we must be creatures who can despair at what we love. And depression is the mechanism of that despair. When it comes, it degrades oneself and ultimately eclipses the capacity to give or receive affection. It is the aloneness within us made manifest, and it destroys not only connection to others, but also the ability to be peacefully alone with oneself. In chapter 10, verse 1, Job says, "Why did you let me be born?" Depression brings us this mechanism that brings us down to a place of despair. This visual image of Job sat on an ash heap, scratching himself with a pot, I find resonates with me as I read a thought like this from Andrew Solomon. The difficulty, you see, for many of us, however, of talking about a subject like this, and even more the difficulty of living with it, is it's made significantly hard by the still common perception that it's not really real. We live in this context where we're so rational as people, but so tangibly connected that if we can't feel it or touch it or see it, there's a sort of suspicion out of it. But this is real. The things that go in our mind might not be touchable, but they're real. They're not something you can snap out of. They're not a character flaw. Essentially, at some level, I might say this: the things that go on in our mind will always be something for us to struggle with as long as we have consciousness. You know, and then we say things like this. I hear this from time to time. Well, but isn't depression and this whole mental health a kind of new thing? You know, kind of like a millennial fad. You know, we sensitively ask as if it's something like Facebook. It's just things that young people get. And, but here's where I stand on. Here's where I stand on this. That this isn't new. Right? If you read texts from thousands of years ago, you see the same stuff that we struggle with today. It's recorded throughout history. Now, what is challenging to us, particularly at the moment and place that we stand in history, is the level at which it's growing, the level at which it seems to be infecting us, the level at which we seem to be more and more struggling with our mental health. And I wonder if some of that is the removal or the beginnings of the removal of its taboo within our society. But I'm also tempted to think that there's something broken with our culture. There's something broken with our society that is most affecting us in our minds. Like we know the statistics and we hear them and they resonate in various different ways with us. We hear them from all sorts of different sources. 1 in 4 people in the Western world experience mental health problems yearly. 10% of people in North America can expect a major depressive episode in their life. And 50% of people will experience some of those symptoms at some point in their life. In the 1960s, 45 was the average age of the onset of depression. The age today, 14. And then we're seeing these worrying rises in suicides amongst teenagers particularly that tell us there's something broken with our world. What worries me is that most people don't seek help. And there's reasons perhaps for that. Perhaps it's because of the stigma. How will I be treated if I open up that there's a journey going on in my mind that some people don't even take seriously? Or perhaps it's finance. Our insurance companies tell us, they don't tell us this in black and white, but most of us will know that our insurance company tells us that they don't think mental health is as real an issue as physical health. Just look at your coverage. And your coverage will offer you thousands for one thing, but almost pennies for another thing. Only 50% of people struggling with major depression actually go to their doctor. And this is a challenge for us. So perhaps not that different from Job's time. Perhaps all of our advancements, all of our technologies, all of our learning, we still find ourselves sat alone on an ash heap, scratching ourselves and wondering what is going on. Or perhaps the image that resonates in your heart as you think of this man sat there is the desperate loneliness of that. Eugene Peterson, as he introduces us to Job, says this: the book of Job is not only a witness to the dignity of suffering and God's presence in our suffering, but is also our primary biblical protest against religion that has been reduced to explanations or answers. Many of the answers that Job's so-called friends give him are technically true, but it's the technical part that ruins them. They are answers without personal relationship, intellect without intimacy. The answers are slapped onto Job's ravaged life like labels on a specimen bottle. Job rages against this secularized wisdom that has lost touch with the realities of God. So Job becomes this book for us to invest ourselves in at this particular point of our lives, perhaps. It's a book that you'll find hope in one way and solidarity in another way. I want to invite us as a church to do something that maybe we've not done for a while. And over the 3 weeks of this series, I want to invite you to read Job with me. The series is 3 weeks long. Job is 42 chapters long. So 2 chapters a day over the course of this series, and you'll find you've read your way through this immense book. And whether your journey is one of struggling with your mental health, or whether your journey is alongside someone, this insight into this man's journey and all of the sort of annoying things that people say, the false logics get thrown there, I think you'll find huge solidarity and comfort in it. And I think you'll find yourself agreeing with Peterson. There's something profound, I think, about a biblical religion that doesn't just simply offer answers. It's hard for us because we like cause and effect in the contemporary world. We want to be able to say, this was what was done and this is what happened. We like being able to draw the lines and put it all together and make sense of it all. And Job's friends become the sort of model of that in our own situation. They become this model of, this is what people like to do. Let's figure this out. And every generation since Job has done this. Notice how often somebody appears with the keys to health, wealth, and happiness. And it's kind of is rolled out to us that if you just do these particular things, everything will work well for you. And you're sat there with a stack of books gathering dust on your shelf based on what the latest, if you do this, you will be successful journey was. And oftentimes these books are ignorant to actually how often these so-called keys are just luck. That somebody happened to have something go well for them, while somebody, it didn't go so well with them. And I think this is where we connect with a journey like Job. This is where we, the church, should connect with a journey like Job's. Not in the answers that Job doesn't supply, but in the solidarity. In the sense that this journey is not just your journey. The loneliness of a journey of what's going on in our minds doesn't need to be as lonely as it often is. Perhaps we should connect with Job not in looking for cure, but in care. And that's probably our position as a church. You know, we're not psychologists. You know, we don't stand up here every morning and just offer a way to beat that insurance limit that you've got. That's not the profession we're in, and hopefully you know that. But what we do want to say is that we're here. We're here to offer solidarity. We're here to journey with you. We're here to walk along this strange road of uncertainty. And we want to broaden your world. We want to push out at those sort of closing boundaries. We want to treat people with respect because we know this, that depressions and anxieties do the opposite of that. Depression, fear, anxiety, stress, self-harm, feelings of suicide, they all have this one thing in common. They shrink your world down and dehumanize you. They drop you down into a place where it feels like it's just you. It's kind of choking and small, and all of the things that you are afraid of or worried about or concerned about or obsessed about, they constantly just shrink your world down so that you find yourself sat on the ash heap, scratching yourself with pottery like Job. Or we find ourselves fearful of a world that seems dangerous, out of control of a world that we want to control. Or we end up depersonalized. People who struggle with their mental health journey often talk about this depersonalization. You become a thing. You become an issue. You become a problem. That's David. He's got depression. And we whisper it because that person becomes stigmatized. And that pushes us into more places of loneliness. That pushes us into more places of being cut off. And that makes us feel hopeless. But I wonder if just talking about these things, if just opening them up in a safe place actually pushes back against this shrinking, that pushes back against this sense that maybe, just maybe, I'm not alone here. I know this, and I know this because I lived this journey myself. I've talked to you about this in the past. It's in the previous series you can listen to on the podcast of my own journey with this. But I know what it is to live with anxiety and depression. I know what it is to journey that myself, and I know how it wants to push me into a place of loneliness. But I also know how talking about it, I know how having people in my life that are aware of it helps me push back against that constant feeling of that shrinking world. So part of the reason that we talk about this subject regularly here at Westside is because we want to step beyond the taboo. We want to say that Westside is a church where there is no stigma about this particular journey. And so for me, I hope that by sometimes talking about it, by sometimes unpacking this sort of allows this sense of maybe here this is okay to talk about it. Like, I know what it's like historically. There was this sort of idea that pastors had to have it all together, right? And pastors and their wives and husbands and also their kids, like they had to have it together because our pastors are these personal people. And all that did was make pastors liars, right? Because they just had to walk around pretending like we had it all together. But that's not how the gospel works. It's not how church should work. But rather, we find ourselves on a journey, and all of us are carrying something, right? All of us have those journeys. It's very unlikely that anyone in this room can read the story of Job and not find some moment in it that we say, yes, I understand and relate to this journey. When I read Job, this journey feels familiar. This brokenness feels close. Job seems like a story that I understand. I recognize the sort of kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions in his speeches to his friends, in his speeches to himself, in his speeches to God. At points, the storm that Job finds himself in confuse him. He finds himself a little bit like, why is this happening? I don't understand this. I'm doing all the math. I'm figuring out all the rationales, and it doesn't make sense. And at other times, this tempest outrages him. Job is angry about the life that he finds himself in. And so Job does something that I find profound in this book of the Bible. Job often says boldly what many of us are just too timid to say. He makes poetry out of what many of us are only a tangle of confused whimpers. And Job shouts at God a lot of things most of us would only mutter behind our sleeves. Job faces up to his situation. He doesn't whimper and move away into the background and hide behind the curtain. But Job comes out, and at times he rages. And many of us, as we read Job together, will actually find huge solidarity in that. Because we realize here we have in Scripture not nice, safe, Queen's English musings about our trouble, but rage and anger and pain that says, I don't like where I am. See, the journey of faith isn't a journey of just quiet acceptance all the time. And the book of Job points out that sometimes it's okay to let out those feelings. It's okay to unpack where you're actually up to. And this is the Job that you meet across this book. This is the Job that as you journey with him and he peers into his own heart and mind, you see these conflicted, kaleidoscopic emotions. But then, in chapter 38, after long conversations and much talking and high moments of anger and deep, dark moments of despair, something happens within the tempest. In Job 38, it begins with these words, "And then the unnameable answered Job from within the whirlwind." This incredible moment in the text. What's fascinating in this moment is the metaphor is so huge and real for us that when you read it for the first time, you weren't aware there was a storm. But this storm seems to be depicting Job's whole situation, not a physical storm necessarily that's ripping up trees, or maybe it is. It's not clear when you read this poem, but this tempest that is destroying his life. And there, in the midst of this tempest, the God of the Bible speaks to Job. Job is out of control. Job is without answers. Job is unable to fix things. And that's where he encounters God. And God doesn't bring him any answers. But as you read the text, you realize that Job no longer has God as this abstract, faraway concept. Because what you'll realize when you read Job is he's not that certain about what God is like. He's not really sure where God fits into this whole process of his life. He knows he's there, but he doesn't have any connection to him. And out of this tempest speaks God, and now he's real for Job. And perhaps that's the great mystery of suffering. Perhaps that's the great mystery of anyone who journeys through pain, is how often that journey brings us into the presence of God. Why is it that brokenness seems to open a door into a moment where we can be near to God? I don't really understand that. Job doesn't really seem to understand that. Not many of us understand that, but many, many people will tell us that these are the moments where God becomes close to us. And God does something profound for Job. He helps locate him. He puts him in a place, and he helps Job understand where he fits a little bit. Job starts to realize more about himself as he meets and hears from this God. And I wonder about that. I wonder about how much of our depression, how much of our stress, how much of our anxiety actually finds its roots in us just not being happy at who we are. And Job finds himself face to face with God, starts to understand where he fits a little bit more, and it maybe relocates him in a way that helps him. Because God turns up, God is present. And he doesn't provide answers, because the first thing we need is not answers. God speaks in the storm, but God, that means he is there. Peterson continues, the book of Job does not reject answers as such. There is content to biblical religion, but it's the secularization of answers that's rejected. Answered severed from their source, the living God. The word that both batters us and heals us. We cannot have truth about God divorced from the mind and the heart of God. So here's what I think we find in Job, which therefore means that this is what we find in the scriptures, which therefore means that this is what we find in our faith, that God can find us in the tempest. And that God isn't just abstract answers that make sense of life, but he's with us in that storm. That God can be more real to us there than he can be in the so-called normal places. And let's remember, this is the God that finds Job in the storm. This is the same God that found Jesus in the tomb and raised him from the dead. So the biblical story of Job calls us to journey along with that in our suffering and our pain, not as a way to make sense of everything. The Bible doesn't say become a Christian so that you can understand your own mind. Become a Christian so that you can make sense of the pains in your life. But the Bible offers us something different. A God who is there in the tempest. Job says this in chapter 6. If ever my grief were measured or my sorrow put on a scale, it would outweigh the sands of the ocean. That is why I'm desperate. You can't live like this. We know that. Job's life, the life of a tormented mind, it often isn't sustainable. But we also know this. The cure isn't one sermon. The cure isn't a series of sermons. The cure isn't one answer that explains it all. For us, part of the confession of the gospel is this confession that God is with us in the storm, that Jesus is there in the tempest. Because what we don't need always is just logics and rationales and answers. What we need is something to be here, is someone to be here. So there's a level at which for all of us, this Job story becomes a model for us. We teach this series every year because we know that our minds and our lives can become unbearable. But as a church, not just simply as an organization, but as a group of people, it's important that we actually journey in a place to say, we're here. What if God's place in the tempest is a model for all of us to say, that's how it needs to be? For those of us in the dark places, we need to hear the sense that someone is there. And for those of us who perhaps this is not our journey, the rest of us say, we need you to be here. The stats are pretty clear. If it's not your journey, it will be the journey of someone you know. I want to invite you to sit for a moment. The band are going to sing to you. And just as they sing, just reflect. Take a moment, breathe in. Perhaps think about your own journey or ask God to speak to you about the journey of someone else. And after the band sing, I'll come and pray for you. Thank you. We, as pastors, are always here. We're working constantly behind the scenes to pray for you, to be available for you. We have, over the last little while, put together a team of people that are happy to connect with you and journey with you. And I want to say, later on in this series, we'll take a moment in our service for some prayer and response. But pastors are here this morning if you'd just love someone to pray with you, or perhaps you need to reach out to us during the week. I want to invite you to read with us this story of Job. If you go to the church app, the reading plan is there, and you can follow and track it really easily. We'll post that through our social media daily as well. As has been our tradition, we're going to have a seminar on the 30th of January that just kind of closes out this series, and we'd love you to perhaps join us and bring a friend to that. But before we do any of those things, I want to just pray for you this morning. Perhaps you'd love to just close your eyes for a moment. Our prayer is deeply simple this morning. And may you, for whom the grief outweighs the sands of the ocean, or the depression, or the anxiety, or the stress, may you in the tempest be found by the God who found Job, who raised Jesus out of death, and who loves you and can carry you even without all the answers. May that God be with you today. And may his grace and peace be with you too. Amen and amen.